Hello everyone, hope you're doing really well. So, last time we finished chapter number 6 of Modern History by Bipin Chandra, and today we are going to study chapter number 7, The Administrative Changes After 1858, from the same book, Bipin Chandra. And yes, let's start reading. The revolt of 1857 gave a severe jolt to the British administration in India and made its reorganization inevitable. The government of India's structure and policies underwent significant changes in the decades following the revolt. But more important for changes in the Indian economy and government was the inauguration of a new stage of colonialism in India. The second half of the 19th century witnessed a spread and intensification of the Industrial Revolution. Gradually, the other countries of Europe, the USA, Japan underwent industrialization, and the manufacturing and financial supremacy of Britain in the world economy came to an end. Intense worldwide competition for markets, sources of raw materials, and outlets for capital investment now began. The competition for colonies and semi colonies became increasingly intense and bitter as areas open to fresh colonial domination became scarce. Facing a challenge to its dominant position in the world capitalism for newcomers, Britain began a vigorous effort to consolidate its control over its existing empire and to extend it further. Moreover, after 1850, a very large amount of British capital was invested in railways, loans to the government of India, and to a smaller extent in tea plantations, coal mining, jute mills, shipping, trade, and banking. It was necessary that to render the British capital secure from economic and political dangers, British rule in India be clamped down even more firmly. Consequently, there was a renewed upsurge of imperial control and imperialist ideology, which was reflected in the reactionary policies of the viceroyalties of Lytton, Dufferin, Lansdowne, Elgin, above all Curzon. The first is administration. The Act of Parliament in 1858 transformed the power to govern from East India Company to the British Crown. While authority over India had previously been wielded by directors of the company and board of control, now this power was to be exercised by the Secretary of State for India, aided by a council. The Secretary of State was a member of the British cabinet and as such was responsible to Parliament. Thus the ultimate power over India remained with the Parliament. Under the Act, government was to be carried on as before by the Governor General, who was also given the title of Viceroy or Crown's personal representative. With the passage of time, the Viceroy was increasingly reduced to a subordinate status in relation to the British government in matters of policy as well as execution of policy. The Secretary of State controlled the minutest details of administration. Thus, the authority that exercised final and detailed control and direction over Indian affairs came to reside in London, thousands of miles distant from India. Under such conditions, Indian opinion had even less impact on government policy than before. On the other hand, British industrialists, merchants, bankers increased their influence over the government of India. This made the Indian administration even more reactionary than it was before 1858. For now, even the pretense of liberalism was gradually given up. In India, the Act of 1858 provided that the Governor General would have an executive council whose members were to act as the heads of different departments and his official advisors. The council discussed all important matters and decided them by a majority vote. But the Governor General had the power to override any important decision of the Council. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 enlarged the Governor General's Council for the purpose of making laws, in which capacity it was known as the Imperial Legislative Council. The Governor General was authorized to add to his Executive Council between 6 and 12 members, of whom at least half had to be non-officials who could be Indian or English. The Imperial Legislative Council possessed no real powers and should not be seen as a sort of elementary or weak parliament. It was merely an advisory body. It could not discuss any important measures and no financial measures at all. without the previous approval of the government. It had no control over the budget. It could not discuss the actions of the administration. The members could not even ask questions about them. In other words, the Legislative Council had no control over the executive. Moreover, no bill passed by it could become an act till it was approved by the Governor General. On top of all this, the Secretary of State could disallow any of its acts. Thus, the only important function of the Legislative Council was to ditto official measures and give them the appearance of having been passed by legislative body. In theory, the non-official Indian members were added to the council to represent Indian views. But the Indian members of the legislative councils were few in number and were not elected by the Indian people but were nominated by the Governor General, whose choice invariably fell on princes and their ministers, big zamindars, big merchants, or retired senior government officials. They were thoroughly unrepresentative of the Indian people or of the growing nationalist opinion. The government of India remained as before 1858 as alien despotism. This was moreover no accident but a conscious policy. Charles Wood, Secretary of State for India, while moving the Indian Council's Bill of 1861, said, "All experience teaches us that where a dominant race rules, another, the mildest form of government, is a despotism." Provincial administration. The British had divided India for administration convenience into provinces, three of which, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, were known as presidencies. The presidencies were administered by governor and his executive council of three, who were appointed by the crown. The presidency governments possessed more rights and powers than the governments of other provinces, which were administered by lieutenant governors and chief commissioners appointed by the governor general. The provincial government enjoyed a great deal of autonomy before 1833, when their power to pass laws was taken away and their expenditure subjected to strict central control. But experience soon showed that vast country like India should not be efficiently administered on the principle of strict centralization. The evil and extreme centralization was most obvious in the field of finances. The revenues from all over the country and from different sources were gathered at the center and then distributed by it to the provincial governments. The central government exercised strict control over the smallest details of the provincial expenditure. But this system proved quite wasteful in practice. It was not possible for the central government to supervise the efficient collection of revenue by a provincial government or to keep adequate check over its expenditure. The authorities therefore decided to decentralize public finance. The first step in the direction of separating central and provincial finances was taken in 1870 by Lord Mayo. The provincial governments were granted fixed sums of money out of central revenues for the administration of certain services like police, jails, education, medical services, and roads, and were asked to administer them as they wished. Lord Mayo's scheme was enlarged in 1877 by Lord Lytton, who transferred the provinces certain other heads of expenditure like land, revenue, excise, general administration, and law and justice. To meet the additional expenditure, the provincial governments was to get a fixed share of the income realized from the provinces from certain sources like stamps, excise taxes, and income tax. Further changes in this arrangement were made in 1882. The system of giving fixed grants to the provinces was ended, and instead a province was to get the entire income from the certain sources or revenue within it, a fixed share of this income from other sources. Thus, all the sources of revenue were now divided into three: general, provincial, and those to be divided between the center and the provinces. The different measures of financial decentralization discussed above did not really mean the beginning of genuine provincial autonomy or the Indian participation in provincial administration. They were much more in nature of administration, whose chief aims were to keep down expenditure and increase income. In theory as well as in practice, the central government remained supreme and continued to exercise effective detailed control over the provincial governments. This was inevitable. For both central government and the provincial governments were completely subordinated to the Secretary of State and the British government. Local bodies. Financial difficulties led the government to further decentralize the administration by promoting local government through municipalities and district boards. The Industrial Revolution gradually transformed the European economy and society in the 19th century. India's increasing contact with Europe and new modes of imperialism and economic exploitation made it necessary that some of the European advances in the economy, sanitation, and education should be translated in India. Moreover, the rising Indian nationalist movement demanded the introduction of modern improvements in civic life. Thus, the need for education of the masses, sanitation, water supply, better roads, and other civic amenities was increasingly felt. The government could not no longer afford to ignore it. But its finances were already in disorder due to heavy expenditure on the army and the railways. It could not increase its income through new taxes, as the burden of the existing taxation was already very heavy on the poor, and further addition to it was likely to create discontent against the government. On the other hand, the government did not want to tax the upper classes, especially the British civil servants, planters, and traders. But the authorities felt that the people would not mind paying new taxes if they knew that their proceeds would be spent on their own welfare. It was therefore decided to transfer local services like education, health, sanitation, and water supply to local bodies who financed them through local taxes. Many Englishmen had pressed for the formulation the local bodies on another ground also. They believed that that associating Indian administration with in some capacity or other would prevent their becoming politically disaffected. This association could take place at any level of local bodies without any way of endangering British monopoly of power in India. Local bodies were first formed between 1864 and 1868, but almost for every case they considered of nominated members and were presided over by district magistrate. They did not therefore represent the local self-government at all, nor did the intelligent Indians accept them as such. They looked upon them as instruments for extraction of additional taxes from the people. A step forward, though a very hesitant and inadequate one, was taken in 1882 by Lord Ripon's government. A government resolution laid down the policy of administering local affairs largely through rural and urban local bodies, a majority of whose members would be non-officials. These non-official members would be elected by the people wherever and whenever officials felt that it was possible to introduce elections. The resolution also permitted the election of non-official as chairman of a local body. But the elected members were in a minority in all the district boards and in many of the municipalities. They were moreover elected by a small number of voters, since the right to vote was severely restricted. District officials continued to act as presidents of district boards, though non-officials gradually became chairman of municipal committee. The government also retained the right to exercise strict control over the activities of the local bodies and to suspend and supersede them from their own discretion. The result was that, except in presidency cities of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, the local bodies functioned just like departments of the government and were in no good example of local self-government. All the same, the politically conscious Indians welcomed Ripon's resolution and worked actively in these local bodies in the hope that in time they could be transformed into effective organs of local self-government. Thank you everyone. This was part 1 of chapter number 7. Join us again for the part 2. Thank you and all the best.